Choudhury, who is serving as the Evelyn Clark Chair as Professor of History, and is Department Chair of the History Department at Vassar College. She received her PhD from Northwestern and is the author of numerous books and articles, including The Wanton Jesuit and Wayward Saint, A Tale of Sex, Religion, and Politics in 18th Century France, which came out with Penn State in 2015, and Convents, Nuns, and Nuns in 18th Century French Politics and Culture, which came out with Cornell in 2004. Her current project is on sexual assaults in convents.
Sorry. I'm not going to stay on forever. Thank you for that, Mita, and thank you for organizing this panel as well. And thank you to all in this last gasp of this wonderful, wonderful conference. As Mita started to say, so my project is actually on sexual assault within the church, not within the church, but involving the church in the 17th and 18th century. And it is very much a project that has been influenced by the present. You know, I state that very unabashedly. I think it's the events, the kind of the emergence of what has happened over that has been revealed over the last 5 or 6 years that really got me thinking about this project. And to that end, I'm doing something that some may think is controversial, is I'm really interested in looking at having a project that is in fact victim-centric, that interrogates the power dynamic between clergy and penitent, as well as the mechanisms of faith that shape the experience of violence. And in doing something, in being that open in terms of my own kind of where I come from as a present, I'm also working very hard to think about the categories of analysis that I use, including thinking about questions such as consent and agency. So to that extent, I think what my presentation will reflect is more of that kind of meta-history approach at the moment. And so obviously when we think about these categories, the category of consent, there's a way in which it's suggestive of transaction between individuals, and I think consent also signals agency, and a kind of subjectivity that is at once cohesive and independent. And at the same time, I think we also recognize that consent is enmeshed within systematic attitudes involving gender, race, status, as well as certain kinds of relationships that are shaped by institutions and individual positionality. And that these kinds of systems also create systems of credibility that come into questions about consent. And I think the added dimension too, which is about consent, which makes it more complex and fraught, are the ways in which individuals internalize cultural attitudes and practices, and that can then manifest itself in the form of shame. And the other layer that is specific to my project is thinking about the role of faith. So having said that, I want to unpack that. Now, it's pretty easy to think about the church as an institution and the structural impediments that I would argue are embedded in impediments to consent that I think are embedded within that relationship. I mean, you have to consider the position of the clergy, which is canonically been laid, male clergy, to be separate from the laity. And so it's buttressed by doctrine, by theology, but also in most cases also by gender. I mean, given the fact that the position that the male cleric holds as this kind of mediating figure between the divine and the believer is not something afforded to nuns, for example. That's my only mention. Oh, actually, I'm going to be mentioning nuns again. But the key thing here is that this position allows for access and intimacy within the confession, and I think this is particularly true starting with the Catholic renewal in the 17th century, where confession and spiritual direction becomes so important. And moreover, it's a kind of authority that often can go unchallenged because it's built on trust and faith. And here, I borrow from sociologists Susan Rain and Stephen Kent, who in their comments about contemporary cases of sexual abuse in the church say the following, which I think applies to the early modern as well. Quote, the Catholic Church is an extremely hierarchical institution. Priests mediate Catholics' relationships with God, thus they occupy immense positions of trust, positions that in some cases afford opportunities for grooming. Obedience to religious authority characterizes the hierarchy where children have no power. And obviously the question of children has been very contemporary, but I think it can go beyond that. Fearful of disobeying God and his representatives, priests, and mindful of otherworldly punishments going to hell, children are especially vulnerable to manipulation. To question that which has been bestowed with religious meaning and significance often may be difficult, if not impossible. So I think that that's really, when thinking about this question of consent within the question of sexual violence in the church becomes all that much more difficult, because there's a power dynamic of belief that's about unquestioning obedience that's difficult to challenge, because to challenge that authority is not simply about disobedience, but is also about sin. And moreover, it puts the predator priest in a kind of a really high level of authority, because they can exploit precisely that fear of sin to gain access. Now, obviously these comments were made, these remarks were made by sociologists in the last few years, where finally we're starting to see some level of accountability. And I only say some level because I think the depths of what had happened go well beyond what has been documented. And what's been interesting is I have looked at sources. I looked at the records of the officialité in Paris, in Besançon, in Macon, in Lyon, Bordeaux. I couldn't go to Montpellier because I got COVID. But also you also have to look at cases of spiritual incest, which is Toulouse, for example, has a high record of them. And part of what I'm trying to do, and I will be going back again, is to, is going to as many archives as I can, because in honesty, I feel like I have a moral responsibility to try and find these voices, as well as a historian, really thinking about the regional differences. So one thing that I found is, first of all, there's a lot less reticence than you would think in terms of bringing badly behaved priests to task. But the question that is interesting is how it's done. So there was a case in 1756 where a Sœur Clerc wrote to Monsieur Navarre, the promoter of the Lyon officialité, about how his young daughters had been violated by the Sœur Gazon, the curé of La Baume. Clerc had initially kept quiet when his eldest had been raped, but then came forward with the knowledge that his other daughters, as well as other children in the parish, had been affected. Gazon's infractions then, as the sources reveal, went beyond. They included financial misdemeanors, irregularities, giving the sacraments. There were 10 other parishioners that joined Clerc in his complaints. And there are a few things that strike me is, and then I compare it to these other cases, most of them, the priest is brought before the officialité when it's not just one person. It's very rarely one person, it's multiple people. And I mean, in fact, the moments where it's just one individual really stand out, as opposed to a community bringing that forward. And to me, I was really struck by this, is the silence of the girls and of the children in a lot of ways. So in other words, what we see then is that their possible resistance, their lack of consent went unregistered. And a question I would ask, given the nature of that relationship between priest and believer, was it even possible? And I think that's a very tricky thing to think about historically, but I think it's a very real thing. And so, because I think what's going on here is that this is a dynamic that's not just central. It's not just a power dynamic central to the relationship, but it's also part of the subjectivity of the believer that complicates all of this. And it's also because not only is one powerless, but one is unable to imagine oneself as being empowered within that particular relationship that adds to it. So what I want to turn to is an example from the Histoire de Madeleine Baron from 1647, and this comes out of the physician witchcraft trial of Louviers in Normandy in the convent of Saint-Louis and Sainte-Elisabeth. And it was a possession trial much like the one in Aix and and Loudun, the two famous ones from the earlier 17th century. And the Louviers trial is actually covered in Sarah Ferber's demonic possession and exorcism. And I won't go into details, and I'll explain in a minute why I'm interested in witchcraft trials. Baron was a Tourière, she was lower class, and interestingly enough, she was both a victim of possession, but she was also accused of witchcraft. So she was shuttling back and forth, and she was imprisoned under horrific circumstances. And then what happens is that a local priest, Desmarais of Rouen, writes a first-person history using the interrogation records, and it's a new confession that's not under duress. So is presented as being true. And here, I think it's really interesting because her voice is being ventriloquized. And that's something we often see, is that to expect those direct voices, again, we're always going through these layers, right? And it's about, the central argument of this is about corrupt priests who use their spiritual authority to gain access to the bodies and souls of the nuns. And I think they give an interesting take on this problem of consent. Baron describes the priest Pierre David, the first priest who assaulted her, ce mauvais et dangereux prêtre, as making the nuns in the convent engage in abominable practices under the pretext of introducing perfect obedience. Okay? So here we have is that David uses precisely those vows, right, and those expectations to present, to enforce his will, and to engage in a variety of sexual acts. And the question then is, of course, did Baron have the choice to consent since obedience was required of her? And in fact, she describes that when she resisted, I became a disobedient girl, opinionated, rebellious, proud. All of these things were attached to who I was. I mean, that's a loose translation of what she says. So that's another thing, that system of credibility that she's coming up against, that plays another role. Later, another priest, Mathurin, arrives to the convent, and he pursues her and harasses her, making it impossible for her to resist. And Baron describes the following: I never ardently loved this wretched priest, but I cannot say why I attached myself to him, or what unfortunate power he used to hold me. And I think this is really interesting because in a lot of ways you would say, I mean, it's probably strategic within the legal system, but I think it's also signals an erasure of self, and that a kind of fragmentation that is produced within the trauma of sexual violence that I think that we kind of have to take seriously on some level, and that is difficult, and I think that's what complicates consent, is because, I'm thinking about what Colin said earlier today is in terms of flashbacks. We're dealing with memories. We're not dealing with these cohesive, subjective selves. If we're dealing with traumatized selves, then what kind of historical record, in fact, are we being given? And here I've been influenced by trauma studies. We have historical studies that often think about trauma in a collective sense. I'm thinking of Ronan Steinberg's recent book on terror, or books on the Holocaust, and so forth. But I take a cue from Donna Trembinsky, who has said that, and people may say, oh, you're using contemporary categories, be careful. But, they can help us access the symptoms and experiences, as long as we acknowledge and are careful of the kinds of terminologies that are used, right? and the ways in which trauma can be expressed and explained. And to frankly, as writers with the public, sometimes it helps us if we use known categories to give our readers, our public, a way to access that information. I have found also the use in Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps Score, and some of his ideas as well. The idea of disassociation, which is about fragmentation involving flashback, physical responses, strong emotions. The fact that in trauma, the survivors often lose their words. The ability to explain, to provide that cohesive narrative, coherent narrative that is demanded of them is impossible and difficult because it's about reliving that experience, right? And then also you have a kind of depersonalization, essentially an out-of-body experience. So one of the things that, okay, I'm gonna be really quick here. One of the areas that you could potentially find that is in looking back at mysticism, possession, and witchcraft trials, and that's why I'm revisiting these cases. And I really want to make clear that I'm not necessarily pathologizing faith. In fact, I want to take it seriously, but what I want to suggest instead is not kind of like this was the result, but in fact, all of these things like mysticism and so forth, what they do is they actually become a bizarre thing of preserving that faith. And that the preservation of that faith by talking about the divine, in the case of mysticism, or even that battle in possessions, is in fact, as much as it's about fragmentation, it's also a necessary way of preserving that worldview which is so central to the believer. So that it's operating both as a kind of symptom of fragmentation, but as an effort to keep something whole. And often in these cases, yes, they condemn the priest, but sometimes they support the priest. So it's very, very unstable. So the end, and I'm going to get there, is that in thinking about this worldview, I think it's really clear that the ideas of consent and agency are very complicated, if we quickly put this. And here I'm really influenced by Walter Johnson's critique of agency, his caution, where he says that, quote, agency, quote, smuggles a notion of the universality of a liberal notion of selfhood with its emphasis on independence and choice. And yes, he's talking about slavery, but I do wonder that in fact, our own quest for consent carries with it a heroic narrative that emphasizes resistance and agency because we're seeking the narrative, right? We're seeking a narrative that overshadows the trauma of sexual violence and violation of predation. And, and moreover, as historians, because we are so key to our sources, do we just kind of bypass because things are not named? Things that are difficult to name, then we just glide over. And it's interesting to me because neither Desmarais or Sarah Ferber suggest rape. So you have at bookends, 300, nearly 400 years apart. And yet I think Julie Hardwick's work suggests that the sexual violence exists even if it's not called. So the two questions I'll end with is that we have to kind of consider the burden of this kind of consent and agency as being located in this neoliberal individualism, and what does it mean when you're trying to access shame and faith? And the last thing I would say is that there's the ethics of consent, that the going into the archives, we're going in without permission. We have no way of doing it, but we have not asked, and Julie Hardwick asked me this question, I live with this question, we don't ask permission of our sources. And in a way, we tell that story of violence, and we relive that violence. Do we reaffirm that violence? And do we, in fact, exploit the shame of our subjects? Thank you.